So this is Judy's book that inspired the talk for today. And the thing about this book is that it's the only book on the subject that's written by a developmental psychologist, which means that it looks at death with a view toward personal growth, both for the dying and for the bereaved. So Dr. Stevens Long volunteers with Hospice of Santa Barbara, I know, who've been very supportive of tonight's event. And let's put our hands together and welcome Dr. Judy Stevens Long.
Thanks, Starshine. Well, I'm thrilled to have my hospice family and my Fielding family here together. Since I've left Fielding, I've been volunteering at hospice and working also in their Speakers Bureau for a while. So it feels really good to have everybody in one place. And also our church is here as well. Our church representatives are here, so that's great news too to me. I want to start by saying a little bit, well, I don't know where my co-author is. She's going to be here, though, and when she gets here, I'm going to introduce her. I want to tell you a little bit about my background in this area before we get started. I've been writing about death and dying. The first piece I ever wrote was in 1979 as the final chapter to a textbook called Adult Life. And that book went into 4 editions. So I've been writing about death and dying for a really long time. And I was particularly driven to this both by my own personal experiences in the last 5 years, where we've had a lot of death in our family, including my son-in-law, who was 47 years old when he died and left 2 children, 6 and 10. And we'll be talking about that in this presentation as well. In addition to that, I also realized as I applied for Social Security 10 years ago that I was just the beginning of a long, long line. There are 10,000 people every day applying for Social Security in this country, and that means that over the next 20 to 30 years, 10,000 people a day will probably die. Just in the United States, just elderly people. That doesn't count all of the other people who may die younger. And if you look at that and you think, gee, what if 5 people are affected by the death of this person, or 10 people are affected by the death of this person, you get very quickly to a point where everybody in the United States will probably suffer a major loss in those 20 years. There are so many baby boomers coming through the system. And like always, baby boomers will have a big impact on the system. We ruined the schools, we made it difficult to get into college, you couldn't find a job when you graduated, and now it's going to be hard to find a place to die. So, we are going to have to find other ways to address those kinds of problems, just like we always have done, because Americans are people who at least are inventive when it comes to social systems. And I think that this is going to be a big change in the way we deal with death and dying. I'm especially today challenging the position of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Anybody not know of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross? She wrote a book called On Death and Dying, which started the dying movement in the mid-60s, the idea of talking about death as a process, which has never been popular, continues not to be popular. But she's the one that created the vision of stages, and you probably are familiar with that, the idea that there are stages of grief and bereavement. And as I went through all these experiences myself, I began to understand that the stage model did not really fit my experience or the experience of people that I was going through these events with. And so this presentation is a culmination of all the work that I've done, all the research that I've done on my experience both of writing the book and of being with my son-in-law when he died while I was writing it, and pulling together all that experience and research and just some common sense. I've come up with a new way to look at it. And I'd love to have your feedback on it. We'll have a chance to talk about it toward the end of the presentation. But I'm really looking forward to sharing this with you and getting your reactions, seeing if it's helpful, finding out whether this is going to be a useful way to go. The first thing I want to say is, like one size doesn't fit all. The first thing that happens that differentiates the end of life in one person from the end of life in another person is the way that they find out that they're going to die. And your reaction, the reaction of people in their environment to that trajectory, that death trajectory, which we'll look at in a second, is part of what determines the kind of grief or bereavement or dying experience that a person will have. Make it more difficult, less difficult, faster, slower, all those kinds of things. So here are the 4 trajectories. These are the 4 general ways that people are likely to pass. And this is from a journal article, Journal of American Medicine has the copyright on this. It's a theoretical piece, and it seems really close to common sense to me. The first trajectory is, in a way, the one we all hope for. You're perfectly healthy. You're walking down the street one day, and you just drop over dead. All right, good for you. But not so good for the people you leave behind. These are often the most traumatic kinds of deaths to deal with. So suicide, for example, is that kind of trajectory. Accident, murder, those kinds of really traumatic events, as well as massive heart attack or a stroke. These kinds of deaths leave people in shock for a really long time, are very difficult for people to manage and to confront and to imagine. That's the hardest part, I think, for all of us, is that when someone dies like this, we imagine what happened to them. And that's really scary for a lot of people. The second trajectory is the one I myself prefer. I hope I'll be able to manage this. I'm looking for it. It's terminal illness in which you're diagnosed and you have a few months, maybe a year, to prepare to do the end-of-life business that you need to do, to connect with the people you need to connect with, to give time for people to connect with you at the end of life. The third is organ failure. This is what we went through with my son-in-law. He was diagnosed with glioblastoma a year and a half ago, and he died a year ago. But during that time, he had chemo, he had radiation, he had all kinds of treatments that would result in a burst of wellness and then in more deterioration, and then a burst and then deterioration. My mother, who died of COPD, also had this kind of trajectory where they'd introduce a new medication and she would get better for a while, and then that would kind of wear off or not be working anymore, and then we try a different one and she would be better for a while. A lot of people with metastasized cancer are now experiencing this kind of trajectory because of the use of new immunotherapies and new chemotherapies and new ways of doing radiation and all kinds of non-invasive techniques that can be used to treat. So people go through bursts of well-being and then another decline and so forth. And then this is a way that people die, usually of frailty and old age, where there's just kind of a gentle decline. This side of the scale is function, healthy function, and this side of the scale is time. So the first thing I want to say is that how you react to somebody's death and how they manage their process of dying really depends on what they're dying of. Right? So you might be stuck in shock and anger for a long time after a sudden death, or you might find that it's much easier to accept the death of an elderly person where they're sort of fading away, right? And you have a lot of time to prepare and to be conscious of that. So those are the 4 trajectories I want to talk about, and that's the first way that some variability enters the way we look at these things. Here's Kubler-Ross's model, stages or cycles. It begins with the event here: shock, bargaining, anger, depression, acceptance. It's been known for a fair amount of time that that idea of stages does not fit the data very well. People don't really report going through stages. My early mentor on this was a man named Edward Scheidman, who was a thanatologist in the 70s. And what he said about it was that dying and bereavement are buzzing They're buzzing like a beehive. Emotions are buzzing like a beehive, all at the same time almost. And if those of you who have read Kubler-Ross work at the end, she admitted that it didn't go like that. Her followers have tried to argue that there are cycles. There's information, shock, bargaining, anger, depression, acceptance, information, and you just keep cycling through that set of emotions. I also didn't find that to be the case, and there's also not any really good data that that's the case. So I'm going to suggest a really different way of looking at it that I think is closer to most people's experience. If you go on the website, you'll see this. This is the major piece of business on my website, and I've taken Kubler-Ross's I think Kubler-Ross identified all of the major emotions that drive people during dying and bereavement. And so I put them into 4 different categories because she actually identified 4 different kinds of emotion. Acceptance, which we'll put down here as reflection, the wise one. A kind of bargaining becomes what I call the doer, the person who is negotiating, making lists, making sure that everything gets done, the person who handles the family and does the communication. Another kind of response is what I'm calling the warrior, and this was inspired by my son-in-law, who spent a year dying and never accepted it for one day, not for 1 second. And as I watched him, I thought to myself, that's a perfectly fine way to die. There's nothing wrong with this. That's who he is. He is a warrior. And I'm not going to try to get him to accept the fact that he is dying. And he gets mad at me for treating him like he's dying. So I'm just going to treat him like he's right, and it's not going to happen, and he's not going to die. And he did die. But it wouldn't. The thing is that it wouldn't have made a difference for him necessarily for me to be constantly waiting for him to accept the fact that he was dying or trying to push him to get there. And I think Kubler-Ross's stages have been abused in that sense of us expecting certain people to go through certain things in certain order and get to a certain place, and not everybody does. Kubler-Ross talked about at the end of her life that she was mad all of the time. And so I see her also as having been a warrior, and certainly she used some of the gifts of the warrior in her life. Yes. Okay. So not only do these things not occur in a particular order, they occur every which way. You can be in shock one moment, and the next moment be mad as hell, and the next moment feel like you're never going to get over this. And then the next moment you can find some peace. And it doesn't necessarily start over again. You can go right from peace back to anger, or from anger to being the doer, from being the doer to the fallen. And it seems to me to be created, that response is created by external stimuli more than it is internal stimuli. And it's little things often. You see a picture that you hadn't seen in a while, and you just are so sad. And then maybe you get a bill from the hospital, and you're like, mistakes were made, and I am not paying this, right? Or suddenly you hear a piece of music that reminds you of the good times you had together, and you think, I'm so grateful for what we had. And I feel in tune with the peace of how life is part of death. And that doesn't last very long either. It's not like you get there and stay there. It's like it keeps being a moving target, and it hits you over and over again in waves. And different parts of this are more characteristic of certain people. So I began to think that a lot better way to look at it is to look at it in a Jungian framework, okay? So we're talking about the kinds of archetypes that many of you identify. The journey of the hero, we're all familiar with that. At USC Film School, they say there are only 2 stories in all of the world. One is the journey of the hero, and the other is a stranger comes to town. Now, I think they've forgotten women's stories in that. Women's stories is they come, they go. So, you find archetypes all over the place, though. Tarot cards are one place where people are often struck by the images, because the images hold a lot of cultural weight. They have carry a lot of cultural meaning for many of us. And I'm just talking today really more or less about Western civilization. I do a lot of work on cross-cultural stuff in the book, but right now I'm talking about the kinds of experiences most of us are likely to have. So, let's start by looking at how a person who is a doer might experience bereavement or death, dying. You can't really experience death. Well, we don't know about that, possibly. You can experience near death for sure. So, the doer is the person, this is my daughter, her name was Alexis. While Dawn was dying, she made all the arrangements. She did a lot of the nursing. She called all the family. She did the communication. She talked to the social workers. She got the nurses. She had the conferences with the doctors. She called in the psychologists and psychiatrists and social workers. She gathered her resources. She made lists. She executed. Every single one of these positions or archetypal ways of tending to an event has a very positive side. It keeps everybody feeling like the world isn't going to pieces, like somebody's in charge, like it's being taken care of. And that's a good feeling to have when you're sitting with someone who's bereaved or dying. They show grit, they show determination, a get-her-done kind of attitude. Okay, let's get up, let's get to the hospital, let's get this infusion, let's talk to the nurse, let's see the doctor, let's go home, let's get your medication on time, and so forth. They're not a hero. It's not really the journey of the hero. I see that as a more independent kind of archetype where a person is alone a lot of the time. The hero is alone, maybe has a sidekick. But a doer is a person who is an implementer. Doesn't necessarily have to be the visionary. Hero is also a visionary. An implementer is a person who gets the things done that need to be done, whether he or she is the decider or not. He or she is the one who carries out those instructions and keeps everybody on track. People who assume this archetype are often more collaborative than we think of with the hero too. They ask for help, they get help, they organize their resources, and there's a downside to each one of these positions that if that's your style of handling an event, then you need to be sure that people don't begin to see you as disaffected, distant, or disengaged. You can start to worry. I start to worry about Alexis because she's not crying. She's not as upset as she should be, do you know? But in the Marines, they say, when you face fear, compartmentalize it, set it aside, and take action. And so I think that is pretty much what's going on. If you're a doer and that's your approach to death or bereavement or dying or grief or any kind of major life event, I think it's really important to deliberately take some time to check in with yourself. Give yourself some time to see how you're feeling and to talk to somebody else about it deliberately and to get a little bit out of that denial that allows you to do that kind of work. Because if you do some of the feeling part of it at this point, you're going to be better off later on. You're going to feel more whole than you did if you cut off the feeling part entirely. So that's how the doer might go about dealing with the end of life. The warrior is a person who's angry, and we all go through that. Everybody has anger when someone dies. There's always something really good to be angry at, like the doctors, the hospital, the police, the people who did it, whoever they were, the people that didn't do the right thing, the people that come up to you and say the wrong thing. It's real easy to get annoyed and irritated and angry, and there are people for whom this is their major response. It was for Dawn. It was for the women who organized mad it was for the people behind Black Lives Matter. You can be angry enough about death and dying that you can make a big difference in society. The warrior is the one who usually proceeds to build the big kinds of social and cultural changes that we need around different kinds of issues. So I think anger has a very close relationship with motivation and with a need to make a change and make a difference. I know at Fielding here, where we're so closely allied with topics around social justice, it's really easy to get angry around those things. So that kind of anger is really important. It's really good to have it in a way. It's really good to understand that it's motivating and it helps you to accomplish what needs to be accomplished. But also, when turned against the self, can turn into depression. And in addition to that, can be very difficult for other people to deal with. So one of the things I recommend to people in all of these positions is that you just let it go. If you're angry, go to the 99-cent store, buy a pile of dishes and throw them against the wall. You know, keep a supply of cheap china. Pound your pillow, scream, get a really, really angry song, and march around the house singing it at the top of your lungs. It's important to be able to express that. It's okay to be angry. Everybody's angry about it. You might even be angry at the person who's dying, or the dying person might be angry at their doctor. It's really a common kind of place to be. The fallen. It's most likely to happen to people who are experiencing the death of somebody that they were really close to, really in love with, really expected to spend the rest of their life with. The death of a child, traumatic death, is likely to result in us feeling a great deal of pain, a lot of sorrow. And being close to, when I see them back here, let me go back for a second. One of the things that I like about this particular presentation is that there are lots of ways you can see it as lying along certain polarities. So the wise one and the fallen are closer to the unconscious than the doer and the warrior. Less likely to use denial, more likely to be very aware of the emotions in the room. If you look at it in a different way, do you know task process? Some of the Fielding students I know do. There's a difference between people who like to focus on a task and people who want to focus on feelings. This side of the continuum is more about feelings, and this side is more about the task at hand. So there's lots of ways that it fits into different psychological literatures that we know, and it's one of the things that I am thrilled about. It's important to also understand that the fallen, though it's a very difficult position to live, is also a position where a lot of creativity is possible. Journaling, poems, painting, writing, dancing, all of these kinds, this kind of emotion can be very open to creative ways of dealing with life. And that's the positive side of this. When you're the saddest you could ever be, to sit and listen to a really sad song, something just like Linda Ronstadt's Shattered is the one that I always love when I'm really sad, and feel that coursing through your body, and to be able to write about it or sing about it or paint about it or dance about it. Those are ways of kind of being in this position in a way that can contribute something to your own sense of growth, your own sense of who you are, and to the people around you. And finally, there's the wise one. This is what I call the position of acceptance that Kubler-Ross talks about, where you feel a certain kind of peace. It usually is a response to witnessing, to bearing witness, to reflection on the meaning of life and the meaning of this person's life in particular. And the downside of this, you have to be careful that, again, you don't get righteous about it. Just because you're able to accept it, you're able to live with it, you're to kind of go with the flow, you see life in its greater horizon every once in a while, you can't get other people to be there just because you're there. They need to be where they are, and you need to figure that out and respond to that, as well as being in your own comfortable place at the moment, because you won't stay there. Nobody stays there that I know of. I mean, I'm sure there are some very mature, wise monks and people who have done this kind of work all their life that are able to stay in that position about death and dying, but most of us don't make it. When we do, it's a great relief. Right? So I want to think about what it means to have a good death, given that all of these things are going on emotionally and physically and mentally and spiritually. What does it mean to have a good death? A death that is this is the current definition of a good death that is being promulgated by the U.S. government in its latest 600-page report, which I have reviewed for you and written down in real language in my book. So what they say is that a good death is a death that is in accord with the wishes of the dying person. And that is a position that much of the end-of-life community is in now. You need your advance directives, right? If you have advance directives, you know exactly what you want and where you're going and how you want it to be handled, you will be able to have the best possible experience at the end of life. And certainly, there's a lot to be said for advance directives. It's important to do it if for no other reason than to avoid the pain and conflict and anger that happens when people die without them. It's a big gift to your family. The more specific you can be, the more clear you are about what you want and don't want, the fewer decisions people have to make around you when you can't make decisions for yourself anymore. It's an extremely important part of preparation, but it, to me, doesn't necessarily cover everything that you need to think about, and I'm sure that's true. There's a great new book. It's called I'm Dead, Now What? And it's about that thick. It's not very thick. It's a folio-looking thing, and in there you put down absolutely everything. Your credit card accounts, your passwords, your bank accounts, your insurance, everything that could possibly affect the people that you leave behind. And then you dig a hole and hide it, right? Because somebody gets that, you're in deep trouble. And the book covers this in great detail, talks about decisions about organ donation, CPR, making decisions about CPR and life-sustaining treatments. Do you want antibiotics? There are small decisions like that, and there are big ones, like whether you want to be put on a respirator. So those are the things you need to think about in order to go through this. And Jean West, who's from Hospice, does a wonderful presentation on advanced directives if you get a chance to see it. It also, advanced directives cover disposition of the body, which you would think would be a simple thing. And you can often have a good conversation with somebody you're trying to talk to about dying if you just start with a simple question like, do you want to be buried or cremated? Sometimes people don't react to that too badly as a way to begin, especially if you know what you want. You say, oh, I really want to be cremated. Do you want to be cremated or do you want to be buried? And if you could just get that far, you can start a conversation. Okay? And there's lots of new ways to dispose of a body, by the way. You can be buried at sea. You can have a green burial in which there's no casket and no cement box lining. You have to find a special place that will do that. You can be, Stephen, who is my director of outreach when I came to hospice, is very excited about a new green way of dying that has to do with having your body reduced by chemicals. It has no footprint, or not much of a one. So there's all kinds of new things happening in this area, and keeping your advanced directors up to date and being sure you know what's going on in the industry, actually, is a really good thing to do. And that'll be on my website all the time. Every time I find a new one, I'll put it up there. So come on down. I want to, now I know at 5, oh look, 35 minutes, I did really good. At 5 o'clock, I know some people have to go to another reception. So I want to take a moment to do a little exercise. I think one of the ways to approach what it means to be at the end of life is to, rather than think about how you want to die, think about how you want to live. What does quality of life mean to you? If you have a pet that's sick, you may know that you can go to the doctor and you can get a list that tells you how to gauge the quality of a life of a pet when you're wondering whether that pet needs to be helped in some way through this end-of-life process, or whether they're still, if they still enjoy being petted, if they still eat, if they still want to go outside. These are indications that the pet is still experiencing a good quality of life. So I'd like you to take a few seconds to think about, what are the major things that mean quality of life to you? Is it important to be able to sit up, to walk outside, to talk to other people? Do you want to be conscious? Are you really wanting to be able to sit up in your best chair or to take a drive around the block? It's important to know what quality of life means to you, so you can take that into consideration when you're having your thoughts about what you want to have done if you can't make a decision for yourself. So what I'd like you to do is just turn to the person next to you, or maybe a group of 3. Maybe you could talk to the person behind you, and take about maybe 5 minutes each, or it might take a little longer than that. I'll give you a few minutes to think. And then, once you've thought about it, to talk to the person next to you about what you think might be really important to you at the end of life in terms of being able to function and get along. Okay, so everybody got a partner? Well, that was pretty lively, considering it was about end of life. So, anybody have any reactions to that exercise, or anything you discovered that was interesting about asking that question?
Thank you. My siblings and I were taking care of my mother who passed, and while we understood what was important to her as far as quality of life because of how she lived her life and what her value system was, as she progressed through the dying process, she had less judgment to keep herself safe. And it was hard for her to accept changes that we were trying to implement, like caregivers or adaptive equipment in the bathroom, or, use your walker, Mom. Oh, I don't need that, with 7 falls. And so that was, as a child or as a family member with a dying person, that was, we wanted to maintain her wish to be at home and to die at home, and she did. But the process, the journey, was full of trying, well, how do we problem solve this so that she's happy, so that she feels in control?
Right. Yes, I think one of the people that I'm dealing with right now is going through that, with trying very, very hard to keep her husband out of the hospital, but because he doesn't want to go, but he needs to go. And so, yeah, we're not all going to be able to maintain the quality of life that we want all the way to the end, but we should know what it is so that other people can support us in getting there, and also understand that sometimes that's going to be really hard, and we also have to be available for change. Other people that had reactions?
First of all, I think this is so brilliant, and I'm so happy you're doing this. It's important work. I had the privilege of talking about this with my husband, and we just cried through the whole thing. But I found it surprisingly hard to identify what those things were in terms of, not because I feel like I don't know myself, because I kept on coming up with, well, it depends. It depends on, like, I said, well, I wouldn't want to be in a lot of pain, but you know what? I could tolerate a lot of pain if other things were true. And so I think the only two things that feel like they might be under any circumstances, I probably wouldn't non-negotiable, yeah. One would be is I wouldn't want to not feel like I have control over my choices, or I wouldn't want somebody to make choices for me that I didn't want made. And the other one is I can't imagine being cold all the time. It would be horrible. So that was everything else was it depends.
You know, there's a big piece in the book about fear of dying and why there is so much fear of dying in America. And it's partly learned, because there are plenty of cultures that don't fear dying as much as we do in the United States. And part of it is those little kinds of fears. Fear of being cold, fear of inactivity, fear of immobility, fear of isolation, those kinds of things which, this is a very active, extroverted society, and if you're not out there pitching, you're not part of the plan. So fear of death actually arises, since we don't know anything at all about what it feels like to be dead, probably. Well, maybe we know everything about what it feels like to be dead. Maybe we are dead, who knows? But the important thing is that fear of dying is made up of 1,000 tiny fears. And they all have to do with, a lot of them have to do with what we value as a culture and also what we value as a person, rather than action. Most people say funny things like this, say, I'm not afraid of being dead, I'm afraid of dying. And what they mean by that is, I'm afraid of pain. And there was a wonderful article in the Duke University magazine that my husband gets, which was about fear of death from a doctor. And basically what he said was, ask a person what they're afraid of. If they say they're afraid of dying, ask them what part of dying are they afraid of, because it may very well be something that can be fixed, you know? Okay, no, somebody else over here had their hand up. No, anybody else? Oh, gosh, we've got lots of people. Good.
Hi, my name is Lee, and I didn't have physical things as much as environmental. Like, I'd want to be in a quiet place. I'd like to be able to chant my tone, and if I couldn't do those things, that would be like hell.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So it might be really important for people to assist you in doing those few things, no matter what.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's really important to convey to other people. It's really important to convey your values in specific ways. If you just fill out the advance directives, you want to choose one that has a place where you think about your values a little bit. 5 Wishes does that. The New York Hair from Sansom Clinic, for those of you who live there, has a little piece on what you value. And if you start talking about what you value when you have this conversation with other people, it'll be much easier for them to figure out ways to get there.
Actually, I was just going to echo what Lee said, because she said it to me, at a spiritual place. If you are in dying and there's too many people in your face in both or the hospital or at home, and everybody wants you to be a certain way, you need some space for your own spiritual moment. Yeah. And it's that quality of peace that I think she was touching on so well, that relates to all of us.
Well, we certainly learned this year when Don died at home, my son-in-law, that When you die at home, everybody wants to see you. Everybody wants to connect. People were there 24 hours a day, and also because he was very young, he had a lot of friends, there were children involved. Lots of people wanted to say goodbye. And it's really important for you as a member of the family or the caregiver, as well as for the dying person, to keep that under control, to have visiting hours, to have times when you're going to have space to yourself, and you're not going to have to bake cookies, give people something to drink, wash the dishes, find the napkins, tell them where the bathroom is, all those kinds of things. There's a lot of entertaining involved when you have a person dying at home, which is something it didn't occur to me until we started having droves of people coming over and feeding. They were feeding us. They were bringing casseroles, and we were giving them cookies and drinks and snacks and things like that. So I think it's important to be realistic about that. Did you have a comment, Vicki? No? Okay, I think somebody else would.
Comment on what you just said, and that is people coming to you and greeting you and feeding you and all that. I had an experience when my husband was dying, was that friends and associates dropped off. And that was pretty devastating for both of us.
Was he ill for a long time?
Yes.
Yeah. The hardest thing for caregivers is when they're in one of those trajectories that we had at the beginning, which is either very up and down all the way, or which is just continually failing and takes place over the span of a year or 2 years. So you as a friend of somebody who's in that situation, you as a family member of a person who is a caretaker, remember. And after funerals, this is also another thing. The first week, the first 2 weeks, the first 3 weeks, the person is completely overwhelmed with the amount of attention, flowers, casseroles, people coming by. 3 months from now, it's going to be really hard. And 6 months from now, it's going to be hard. And a year from now, it's going to be hard. And they need check-in all along the way. They need continued support and presence from caring people until it's over, or until the person gets better. So at hospice, we have people get better sometimes, and that's such a joy to the people that are working with them. But it's also like a really long process and a very up and down one when someone gets better. So stay the course with your friend, with your family, with your community member who has someone dying. You need to stay the course. Make it a commitment to stay that course. Somebody else had a comment. Okay, let's take a look at the next slide. Oh, by the way, my co-author is here, Dory. She thought I would be more long-winded. I chose Dory to work with me because she is a superb researcher, a good writer, and a terrific partner. And I really appreciate everything she did. She wrote the chapters on health, on funerals, and on near death. And those were the chapters I felt needed the most intense amount of fresh, new, really current research. We got current, in the book you will find current numbers on how much it costs to have a funeral in all different kinds of places, stuff about how many women are entering the funeral industry, which is a wonderful development, becoming funeral directors and associates at mortuaries and in funeral settings. I want to talk then about a different way of looking at what a good death is that I thinking might be an important thing to consider. A good death is one that supports opportunities for improved understanding of the self and others, the expression of love and forgiveness, and figuring out what has been meaningful in one's, with an apostrophe, own life. Okay, so this model really emphasizes the opportunity in a way that the end of life offers us to be connected, to learn compassion and to show compassion, to have empathy, to listen, to feel, to have presence, to learn how to be with someone in the moment, to learn how not to try to fix it, right? But just to have a quality of relationship in a very present moment kind of way. So when you're dealing with somebody who is a caregiver at the end of life or someone who is dying, you don't want to say something like, "How are you?" It doesn't work. It's really hard to answer that question. What you say is, "How are you right now? Right this minute, how are you feeling?" Try to connect the person to what's going on inside of them rather than to this big giant question of, "How are you?" Well, gee, a lot of things. I'm a lot of things, but right in this moment, I could actually tell you something that would help you connect to me, okay? So what I want to do is an exercise here. Oh, no. Okay. Think about a death that you have personally experienced, someone that you've been close to who died, or think about your own, if you've been in a place where you were facing mortal illness. I went through cancer 5 years ago, stage 3 colon cancer, and I learned a lot about myself, a tremendous amount. It was a huge opportunity. I'm glad I didn't die, but it was a huge opportunity also to figure out what I wanted, who I was, where I was going, where I would want to go, and who I wanted to go there with. So I would say that you can find out enormous amounts of yourself by engaging in this experience and engaging in this discussion and engaging in this community of people that are interested in the end of life. So I'd like you to talk with that same person again, or maybe choose somebody else if you're, you two ought to split up. When you think back, and I'm going to put those four archetypes, and I'm not saying that these are the only archetypes, by the way. I think that I'm just beginning this journey, and I'm probably going to discover more characteristics, ways that people treat death or dying. And I think that these things grow out of one's character and one's temperament, and they are with one your whole life. You're going to be most likely to have one of these responses to a shock or a loss or unexpected event. And you know from your own experience of how you've reacted to trauma before, what your most likely style is going to be. So I'd like you to maybe focus on one of the following aspects, whichever one you choose. All right. Oh, that's the good death slide. All right, and here's the exercise slide. What style did the dying person seem to have? What kind of archetype did they hold for you? Were they accepting most of the time? Were they fighting it? Were they experiencing a lot of pain and sorrow? Were they the kind of person that has a list and keeps on going even to the end, is writing? Like, I expect to be writing on my deathbed. So, I would be a doer in that sense. Or how would you characterize your own emotional reaction to that death that you were close to, or to that loved one that was ill and maybe recovered but was very traumatic in the meantime? So let's take another maybe 15 minutes to discuss that, and then I'm going to take some questions about the ideas themselves. So, anybody have any thoughts about that exercise, about what you heard and what you felt and what you thought?
Is the way I think about death and dying. I've been a hospice volunteer and been through death with loved family members. But that it's a matter of me asking these questions of myself and getting more comfortable
with my thoughts and feelings about it, and then it becomes easier to have that conversation with others. But therein lies the challenge, is the conversation. So I appreciate the questions today and the opportunity to think about this and talk about it.
Oh, good. Anybody else?
I had a hard time identifying where suicidal could be in the 4 quadrants. One can consider it's in a late stage of fallen, but I'm not sure. And I'm not sure it fits exactly on the model, because
I think that these states, people move through all of them, but one tends to be kind of their default position in reacting to loss or trauma. We all have a default position, and I think that comes out of temperament. So I've got 4 grandchildren. They all have different temperaments. I would make guesses that one of them would be angry, one of them would be more accepting, and so forth. But they will all go through all of those feelings at different times. And I think that those feelings change as the environment changes, as you encounter different situations, and you might default to a different position. And it's also possible to move yourself from one position to another. I was just talking to Debbie, for example, our conference person, who said that she tends to go between doing and anger, warrior and anger. She tends to go back and forth between those positions. And I said, well, have you tried meditating, for example, which might get you into a more place of peace and perception? She said, oh yeah, it saves my life. So even though your characteristic response is one way, you can say to yourself, I need to take care of myself, I need to have some time, I need to reflect, and to get into a more accepting place before I go back and get at it again.
I'm on both sides of the spectrum. My mother died suddenly at the age of 66. I was 34. And then my father took 22 months to pass away in a care facility, only because he was given actually 2 weeks to live. And when he went into this care facility, he was actually there 22 months. And my thoughts are, there's nothing, I can't say I prefer either way, because the first, for my mother, it was easier for my mother, tougher for me. For my dad, it was tougher for my dad, easier for me, because it took me, I can say probably 10 years to get over my mom. Only because I started looking at it as this is a new normal. Mm-hmm. It's a new normal to be without my mommy, you know, especially at such a young age. And today, when you brought up anger, it reminded me, I can still get angry at my mom 25 years later. And when I get angry at her is when the good things are going on. Yeah. I get angry when my granddaughters were born because, like, damn it, Mom, you should have been here. Why didn't you take better care of yourself? Yeah. And that's where I go to on that.
Yeah. Grief, especially for your parents, can last such a long time, I think, because you always miss them. Unless you had this really complicated relationship with them or conflictful relationship with them. If you had a good relationship with them, you almost always miss them when the good things happen in your life. Other people that had reactions to that particular exercise? Okay, well, I'd love to have your comments and questions at this point. You can ask me about any of the things that we've talked about, or give me suggestions about the model. How did the model resonate with you? What do you think about the shift from stages to styles or states or character? I'd be really interested in your feedback, in your thoughts, and your questions. Connie.
Thanks, Judy. My name is Connie. I'm a fielding faculty, and over the last 5 years, I've lost both of my parents. One, the trajectory of the 1 year after a major illness, and the other, my mother had Alzheimer's, so that was about a 6-year journey. My father died first. And what I find interesting about the archetypes is I'm the middle of 5 baby boomers, so thinking about the different roles that people in my family played, and especially, so I was kind of more the doer because I'm a social worker, so that made it easy. But then, other people were more detached, and other people, much more emotional and wanting to hang on and so on. And so I was kind of there and also kind of observing at the same time. And I did see that these patterns continued regardless of which parent it was. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in my life with my daughters.
Anybody else have any thoughts or feelings about it?
Yes, I'm just interested, when you went through your cancer journey, did you find anything surprise you? That surprised you?
The most surprising thing I found in the cancer treatment, I was in chemo for 6 months. And I carried around this little port with me, this little thing with me that had chemo in it. So I was in chemo all the time, all day long. And it was delivering this stuff to my system. And I found out that that there's a huge amount of joy that's available. And that really surprised me. It never occurred to me that I would find joy when I was so scared of dying. Well, first of all, the first thing I had was, I wish my mom was here because she could always push me into denial. She would say, "There's nothing wrong with you." She was the queen of it. So that was one of the things that really surprised me, was how much I missed my mom pushing me into denial. And the second thing was how much joy there was in knowing how deeply people cared for me and how much they were willing to do and how they were willing to go out of their way. And the things that they said, like, somebody that I hadn't felt that close to in a lot of years that came up and said, "I don't know what I'll do if you die. It's really important to me that you take care of yourself and get better." So I felt like I was floating on a sea of love a lot of the time, and that was overwhelming, and it really kept me optimistic and able to go forward and able to go through all the pain and the anguish of chemo and radiation, because I knew how much it meant to people.
Just have a quick question. I may be giving away my Catholic upbringing. Why the fallen?
Why the fallen?
Why did you label
The fallen?
Yeah.
I call it the fallen because I was very struck with the idea that there are people in life who really are so full of pain and so full of sorrow that they're unable to move into any other position. And that often comes when someone is very, very close to you. But then I saw also this, it was a tarot card actually, and it was a soldier it was a, what do you call that, sarcophagus with a dead soldier lying there, and all these swords hanging behind him that were going down toward him. It was called the Fallen, and I thought, wow, this is such potential for pain and for grief to be fallen, that I decided to call it that. I just think it brings up a lot of metaphorical ideas to call it the fallen, as opposed to saying, oh, somebody is sad. It is a different level of sad when you're dealing with your own death or when you're dealing with the death of somebody especially close to you. It's very painful and very close to the unconscious as well. And all of this, from my point of view as a developmental psychologist, underneath all of this, all 4 things, is fear. The kind of terror management that we're doing, not to let ourselves get so sucked into that fear that we're immobilized. And when you're fallen, you're close to immobilized as well. It's very hard to get anything done and to pull yourself out of that position. You are digging yourself out of a hole. And that's very much the feeling that I get from that term.
Hi, Judy. Thank you for doing this. It's very practical and helpful. I appreciate it. I'm wondering if you have done, any research into the relationship between disposition of the body after death and the grieving process. We talked about, various ways that you're going to be putting onto the website, always new ways of handling the body after death and so on. It seemed like years ago, maybe not that far back, people made a connection between accepting the reality of the death, believing it, and viewing the body, seeing the body. These days, it seems like in the majority of cases, the person just disappears. And is that good or bad? I wonder.
I kind of go with Kubler-Ross on this one. I think she was right that seeing the body does make a difference. It helps you kind of get rolling on it brings you out of denial if you're in denial. It pushes you toward the expression of emotion. If you don't ever see the body, you don't ever deal with the person that is either close to death or has died, it's very easy to stay quite backed off and disengaged and to not sort of reap the benefits of participation in that person's end-of-life process and in the disposition of the body. I know that, for example, Stephen talks a lot about how people handle the body, and that up until the last 20 years probably, there was a lot of ritual and thought put into handling the body. Many cultures still do. There's a wrapping of the body and the cleansing of the body and the shroud that's used in some rituals. There's a necessity of attending to the body. I think we're better off to attend to the body, and I think that it creates a whole experience that actually moves us through the pain, even though it's painful in itself. And yet I know most people feel that it's really morbid or sick to have an open casket, to handle the body after the person is dead, put a sheet on there and walk away and have the mortuary come and pick up the body and take care of it, and perhaps it's cremated or buried. Nobody ever sees that person again. And it's a kind of truncated experience of life and death. And I think we need to have rituals about the body. They don't need to be open casket. They don't need to be having to do with embalming. For a minute, I was getting old is not a good thing. Embalming. But they can have to do with touching, with embracing, with saying goodbye. Many stories that I've come across and that you'll find in the book of a woman who spent the last night, after her husband died, she spent the night in bed with her husband, holding him in her arms and singing to him and just being with him. And it's not necessary for everybody. It doesn't have to be a big event. But I think how we handle the body of the people that we love is a really important part of the process of going through our grief, our sadness, our fallenness, and not being afraid and being able to connect. I know that William is here from Shared Crossing, S. No S. And his organization is dedicated to helping people experience the very end of life with someone else and being able to share those moments before the other person crosses over. His work is also covered in my book, as is Hospice of Santa Barbara and some of their work. So I think those moments are precious, they're magical, and they're mystical, and they're spiritual, and you miss something if you don't have that as part of your experience. I know when my own dad died, we had a viewing. My mom didn't want it, but my dad didn't care. So they put him in one of those, rooms at Forest Lawn that are called the sleeping room. something like slumber room. And I went in and I saw him lying in his casket, and I had snuck in a beer and a pack of cigarettes. And I stuck the cigarettes in his coat, and I put the beer in the casket, and I sat there for a few minutes with him and talked to him. And it was so soul satisfying to be with my dad, even if he was dead, and to joke with him and to give him his last cigarette. So it can be a very moving, personal, unique experience to spend a little bit of time with someone after they died. And I encourage you to consider it. I know in the Black community, there is a lot of open casket, a lot of viewing, a lot of people who are comfortable with the body after the spirit is gone. And I've been to several Black funerals, and I think it's fabulous that people go up and kiss the person or talk to the person or look at the person before the person goes. It has a lot of meaning, and I think that we make a mistake in skipping over that step. So it might be something that you take into consideration when you're considering disposition of the body. Somebody else had a comment over here. Yeah.
Thanks. Just wanted to speak first of all to ritual, which you mentioned in blessing of the body or washing the body. I think it's really powerful how ritual can help with transitions, with healing, with grief. Actually, both Marcia and I work in grief full time for hospice, and at Serenity House, we always offer a blessing of the body, which is an honoring and a touching, if desired, of the body. And I think it really helps people move through that post, after the death has occurred. And I just wanted to briefly speak to the idea of a model at all, which you asked for feedback. I'm not a huge fan of models in general, but I wanted to just say something appreciative about your presentation, which is it was kind of done lightly with a light offering that there are these modes that humans find themselves in, and you might move from one mode to another. I thought that was very helpful, and I'm thinking about, for instance, that devoted partner, spouse who's the doer, and then finds themselves in grief. Well, you can't really do things to fix grief. It just is. So just kind of being able to use that idea as a way to support people. Well, a different mode is called for now, or you'll move through many other modes. It's a complex process. Yeah, so just wanted to thank you for that.
Yeah, I think we need to take all of these things lightly. We don't want to be pushing anybody to do anything, right? We want to be appreciating where they are. We want to be being with them and also understanding where we are at the same time. So if I'm angry at that person who's dying, which I was pretty angry at Dawn a couple of times. What are you doing leaving your children? I need 5 more years from you. Come on, buck up, buddy. But I didn't say that to him, and I knew in my own self, okay, take it easy, back up. Maybe you should reflect a little on how you're feeling right now. But to be able to accept that in yourself, you're going to have ugly feelings. You're going to do ugly crying and have nasty madness and be miserably sad. And then sometimes you're going to be really okay with it. And it's going to come and go, and it's not going to be predictable, and it's going to be related to the environment that you're in and to the events that surround you. But these are sort of the major emotions of life, and we are going to bring those to the situation like we do everywhere. And there are all ways to move from one place to another. If you're angry, get out and do something about it. Write a letter to the doctor that made you mad, or the hospital, or the police, or whoever it was. Do something. You can do something that expresses that place of being, and then it's easier to move on once you've sort of done something about it, right? In the fallen, the position of the fallen, it's really difficult to do anything. Right? So if you can push yourself to just do the slightest thing, like write about it, or play some music and sing about it, or give yourself the opportunity to physically embody how you're feeling at the moment that you're feeling that feeling, it really helps you to move through it, to acknowledge it, observe it, witness it, and then if you can, let it go. Other questions or thoughts about the model? Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it.
I just want to thank you for the model. For someone like me, it's really helpful. I am not psychology trained. I think I'm probably a minority here. And maybe you look at a model like that and go, well, yeah. I look at people's behavior and where is that coming from? I am clueless. I have this degree in math kind of thing going. So when that model helps me, we were talking, and my husband said, I want to put a label on people. Well, I don't want to necessarily label them, but if I can understand where they're coming from, I can find compassion and patience so much easier. And then if they shift, it's like, oh, okay, now I see where they're shifting from. So I want to thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank you very much. Other comments or ideas? Yes.
So one of the things that I found interesting about your model is that it applies to both the people who are dying and the people who are around them, and that it's so relational. I mean, the dying is so much about relationships too, and that it may create mirrors. So a dying person may take one archetype, and those around them may take other archetypes, and then they may switch. Or they may take the same archetype. It's just the whole question of the relationship and how they link together through those different archetypes. It's interesting to me.
I also recommend to you, if you're interested in the idea of archetypes, to take a look at the Enneagram Institute, ENNEAGRAM. There are 12 basic sort of Jungian archetypes, and I picked out the ones that seem most relevant to the end of life, but it could be that everybody enacts various kinds of archetypes in dying in the end of life, and it's sort of good to know what archetype you're acting out as well, and seeing whether you can resonate with that. I also wanted to point out some of the other wonderful work that's being done in our community. There is a wonderful woman who is the funeral director at McCormick. I want to say McCormick and Schmidt all the time because that is the name of the restaurant. It's McDermott and Crockett. Okay, there's a wonderful woman who's the funeral director. She's wildly creative and open, and she is willing to create any kind of ritual, any kind of funeral, any kind of experience that you would like to have for your loved one or yourself. I think women getting into this business is one of the best things that's ever happened to it. And she has also had a really enormous amount of personal and professional experience in this arena, and is very supportive and helpful to people as they move along. As I meet the end-of-life community in Santa Barbara, it's such a comforting place to be all the time. Nobody goes into this work that doesn't have love and compassion, and I'm so pleased to be around a group of people that are so loving and so compassionate and so caring and really take seriously the hardest things to do in life. Certainly the hospice nurses, oh my gosh, being a hospice nurse is like, I'm sure you get in heaven first. Those kinds of things. I want to thank you all for coming and for facing this with me and for having this conversation. And I hope you take it and talk about it at home and in the community so we can get a really lively conversation in our community about how we're going to care for our people. Thank you so much. I'm doing a book signing next door for those of you that want to contribute to the scholarship fund. And please take a card on the way out. It has my website on it. Yeah. My cards are over on the table. You can take one. It has my website on it, which has all this information for free, and also the name of the book.